This story is one of Japan's most popular and chilling tales about a yokai called Hasshaku-sama, who is said to be sealed away in a certain rural region of Japan. My dad's family home is located just under a 2-hour drive from our house. It's a farmhouse, and I've always liked the atmosphere there. When I started riding a motorcycle in high school, I would often visit by myself during summer and winter breaks. My grandparents were always happy to see me and welcomed me warmly. However, the last time I visited was just before my senior year of high school, so it's been more than 10 years since I last went. It wasn't that I didn't want to go. I couldn't go. And here's why. It was just the beginning of spring break, and the nice weather tempted me to visit my grandfather's house by motorcycle. Although it was still cold, the spacious Engawa was warm and pleasant, so I relaxed there for a while. Then I heard a strange sound. It didn't sound mechanical. It seemed like a person was making it. The sound was somewhere between a voiced and semi-voiced consonant. As I wondered what it was, I noticed a hat on top of the garden hedge. The hat wasn't just placed there. It moved sideways along the hedge until it reached a break in the hedge, where I saw a woman. Apparently, the hat belonged to her. The woman was wearing a white dress. However, the hedge was about 2 meters tall. For her head to be visible above the hedge, she must have been incredibly tall. As I stood there in shock, the woman moved again and disappeared from view along with the hat. The pop-up-o sound had also stopped without me realizing it. At that time, I thought it was either a naturally tall woman wearing extremely thick-soled boots or a tall man in drag wearing high heels. Later, while drinking tea in the living room, I told my grandfather and grandmother about what had happened. I saw a tall woman just now. Maybe it was a man in drag, I said, but they only responded with a nonchalant. But when I added, she was taller than the hedge. She was wearing a hat and making a strange pop-up-o sound. Their movements suddenly stopped. No, they really froze in place. Then, with a stern expression, my grandfather began bombarding me with questions. When did you see her? Where did you see her? And how much taller than the hedge was she? Overwhelmed by his intensity, I answered his questions. After a moment of silence, he abruptly got up and went to the phone in the hallway and started making a call. Since the sliding door was closed, I couldn't hear what he was saying. My grandmother looked like she was trembling. When my grandfather returned, he said,
"You must stay here tonight. No, you can't go home today."
I frantically thought about what terrible thing I might have done, but nothing came to mind. After all, it wasn't me who went to see that woman. She appeared out of nowhere. Then my grandfather said,
"Grandma, take care of him. I'm going to pick up Mrs. K."
He then left somewhere in his small truck. Nervously, I asked my grandmother what was going on. She replied in a trembling voice,
"It seems you've been targeted by Hasshaku-sama. Grandpa will take care of it, so don't worry about anything."
After that, until my grandfather returned, my grandmother spoke to me in bits and pieces.
In this area, there's a troublesome entity called Hasshaku-sama. Hasshaku-sama appears as a tall woman, about 8 shaku, approximately 8 feet, tall, and laughs in a strange, deep voice that sounds like Bobo. Depending on the person, she may appear as a young woman in mourning clothes, an elderly woman in a traditional kimono, or an older woman in work clothes. However, she is always an unusually tall woman with something on her head and has a creepy laugh. There are rumors that she possessed a traveler to come here long ago, but it's not certain. She's sealed in this area by Jizo statues and can't leave. If someone is targeted by Hasshaku-sama, they will be taken to another world within a few days. The last time Hasshaku-sama caused harm was about 15 years ago.
From what I later heard, the Jizo statues seal the paths Hasshaku-sama can travel, as her ability to move seems limited for some unknown reason. Jizo statues are placed at the village boundaries along these paths to prevent her from moving. There are 4 of these boundaries: north, south, east, and west. It seems there was some kind of agreement with neighboring villages, perhaps regarding water rights, which is why they decided to contain her here. Since Hasshaku-sama only causes harm once every few years or so, the people of the past must have thought it was a fair deal if they could secure advantageous agreements. Despite hearing all this, it didn't feel real to me. Naturally, eventually my grandfather returned with an elderly woman.
"This has become serious. Hold on to this,"
said the elderly woman, known as Mrs. K, as she handed me an amulet. Then she and my grandfather went upstairs and started doing something. My grandmother stayed with me, even accompanying me to the bathroom, not allowing me to close the door completely. At this point, I began to think, this might really be dangerous. After a while, I was taken upstairs and put into a room. All the windows were covered with newspaper and amulets pasted over them, with pile of salts placed in all 4 corners. There was also a wooden box-like structure, which couldn't be called an altar, with a small Buddha statue on it. Additionally, there were 2 chamber pots, presumably for me to use.
It's almost sunset. Listen, you must not leave this room until tomorrow morning. Neither your grandmother nor I will call you or talk to you. Do not leave this room until 7 a.m. At 7 a.m. you can come out.
My grandfather said with a serious face, leaving me no choice but to nod silently.
"Make sure to follow what you've been told. Keep the amulet with you at all times. If anything happens, pray in front of the Buddha statue,"
Mrs. K added. I was told I could watch TV, so I turned it on, but I couldn't focus. The rice balls and snacks my grandmother had given me when I was shut in the room remained untouched as I wrapped myself in the futon, trembling. Even in such a state, I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, a late-night program was on TV. When I checked my watch, it was just past 1 a.m. I didn't have a mobile phone back then. I thought it was an unsettling time to wake up, and then I heard a tapping on the window glass. It wasn't like small stones being thrown, but more like someone lightly tapping with their hand. I couldn't tell if it was the wind making the noise or if someone was really tapping, but I tried to convince myself it was the wind. I took a sip of tea to calm down, but I was still scared, so I turned up the TV volume and forced myself to watch. Then I heard my grandfather's voice.
Hey, are you okay? If you're scared, you don't have to force yourself.
Instinctively, I approached the door, but then immediately remembered my grandfather's words. The voice came again.
What's wrong? You can come over here.
It sounded almost exactly like my grandfather, but somehow I knew it wasn't him. I didn't know why, but as soon as I thought that, goosebumps rose all over my body. When I glanced at the corner where the pile of salt was placed, I saw that the top part had turned black. I immediately sat in front of the Buddha statue, gripping the amulet tightly, and began to pray desperately. Please help me. Then I heard the sound again, followed by the tapping on the window glass. I knew that it wasn't tall enough to reach the window, but I couldn't shake the image of it stretching its hand up from below to tap on the glass. All I could do was pray to the Buddha statue. The night felt impossibly long, but morning eventually came. The TV, which had been on all night, was now broadcasting the morning news. The time displayed in the corner of the screen was 7:13 a.m. The tapping and the voice had stopped without me noticing. I must have fallen asleep or fainted. The salt in the corners had turned even blacker. I checked my own watch to confirm the time and then, trembling, opened the door. My grandmother and Mrs. K were there, looking worried. My grandmother cried with relief. When I went downstairs, my father was there too. My grandfather called out from outside,
Get in the car quickly.
When I stepped into the garden, I saw a van parked there, though I had no idea where it had come from. There were several men in the garden as well. The van was a 9-seater, and I was seated in the middle of the second row with Mrs. K in the front passenger seat. All the men from the garden got in as well, surrounding me from all sides.
This is a serious situation. You might be curious, but from now on, keep your eyes closed and your head down. We can't see anything, but you probably can. Don't open your eyes until we tell you it's safe,
said a man in his 50s sitting to my right. Then, with my grandfather driving the lead truck, followed by the van I was in, and my father driving the car behind us, we started moving. The convoy moved at a very slow pace, probably not even reaching 20 kilometers per hour. After a while, Mrs. K muttered,
This is the critical moment.
And began chanting what sounded like a Buddhist prayer. That voice came again. I clutched the amulet Mrs. K had given me and, as instructed, kept my eyes closed and my head down. Yet for some reason, I couldn't help but open my eyes a little and peek outside. What I saw was a white dress. It was moving alongside the car, keeping pace with it in those long strides. The head was out of sight above the window, but it began to lower as if trying to peer into the car. Unconsciously, I let out a small gasp.
Don't look!
The man next to me shouted harshly. I quickly shut my eyes tightly and gripped the amulet even harder. The sound of tapping on the glass began again. The people around me also let out brief sounds of surprise or discomfort. Even if they couldn't see or hear it, they could still hear the tapping. Eventually, the voice and the tapping stopped. Mrs. K then said,
We've made it through.
The men surrounding me, who had been silent until then, also let out relieved sighs. The vehicle stopped in a wide section of the road, and I was transferred to my father's car. While my father and grandfather bowed their heads in thanks to the other men, Mrs. K approached me and said,
Let me see your amulet.
I looked at the amulet I had unconsciously been gripping the whole time. It had turned completely black. Mrs. K said,
I think you'll be okay now, but just to be safe, keep this with you for a while.
And gave me a new amulet. After that, my father and I returned home together. The bike was later delivered by Grandpa and a neighbor. My dad knew about the Hasshaku-sama too. He told me that one of his friends had been possessed by it and lost his life when he was a child. He also knew of people who had moved to other places because they had been targeted. The men in the van were all somehow related to Grandpa's family, meaning they were all distantly related to me. Grandpa, who drove ahead, and my dad, who drove behind, were obviously blood relatives, and they did what they did to try to fool Hasshaku-sama's eyes. My uncles couldn't come over in one night, so Grandpa called on people who were distantly related but could gather immediately. Even so, getting 7 men together on such short notice was impossible, and it was thought that staying inside during the night would be safer than moving at night. Hence, I was locked in the room for the night. During the journey, Grandpa or Dad were prepared to sacrifice themselves instead if the worst happened. After explaining all this to me, they warned me not to go back there again. When I spoke to Grandpa on the phone after returning home, I asked if he had called out to me that night. He firmly denied it. I felt a chill down my spine, realizing definitely that voice wasn't Grandpa's. The Hasshaku-sama's victims are often young people before adulthood, especially children. When children or young people are in a state of extreme anxiety, they are likely to trust a familiar voice. 10 years later, just as I was starting to forget about the incident, an unnerving follow-up happened.
The Jizo statue sealing Hasshaku-sama has been broken by someone. And it was the one on the path leading to your house.
Grandma told me over the phone. Grandpa had passed away 2 years ago, and naturally, I wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. Even before he was bedridden, he had insisted that I must not be brought back there. Even now, I try to convince myself that it's just a superstition, but I can't help but feel quite worried. The thought of hearing that creepy voice again sends chills down my spine.